Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. The second longest war that Washington has ever fought is now 17 years old. Afghanistan, the country where the war to allegedly fight terror related to the 9/11 terror attacks in the U.S. has taken place, is witnessing more violence, more terror, and more terror groups. What exactly has Washington been doing in Afghanistan for all these years, and where is Afghanistan headed to as the war-torn country has become a playground for new actors like Daesh amid an already prolonged war that seems to know no end?
Family members grieving for an Afghan photojournalist. He was killed in a twin bomb explosion in the capital Kabul in late April. Another 24 also died in the bombing, one of the deadliest by the Daesh terror group in Afghanistan in the past months. The attacks have mainly hit urban areas. Kabul has been hit with the most. The targets? Key locations such as military bases and public offices, as well as civilian areas, including mosques and hospitals. Afghanistan's Daesh branch is also known as ISIS Khorasan, or ISIS-K. The group has created havoc in the country, not only for its attacks, but also for its expansion. It emerged in Afghanistan in 2014, gaining its first foothold by June 2015, after seizing districts in the eastern province of Nangarhar. In the months afterwards, the group made more footholds, including in the provinces of Logar, Konar, and Ghazni. ISIS-K also took areas in the northern province of Jozan in mid-last year, only several weeks after the US dropped what is known as the mother of all bombs. Washington said the bombs struck a tunnel complex used by Daesh in Nangarhar.
Really another successful job. We're very, very proud of our military.
But a year on, Nangarhar remains the main stronghold of Daesh in Afghanistan, with the terror group even more fortified. Its first members were defectors from militant groups such as the Pakistani and Afghan Taliban, but the ISIS-K later attracted local Afghans and foreign recruits. Daesh terrorists, leaving Iraq and Syria following last year's defeats there, joined the Afghan branch as well. In March 2017, American officials estimated the number of Daesh terrorists in Afghanistan at 700. Now, they say the number is around 1,500, while Afghan officials say it's between 3,000 and 5,000. Daesh has now turned into a new challenge in Afghanistan, where security was already worsened due to the dragging US-led war against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda groups.
It is like a balloon. We squeeze them in this area and they'll try to move out elsewhere.
Critics accused the US of downplaying the Daesh presence in Afghanistan, a violent presence that has taken its toll on civilians and made scenes like this frequently happening in the country.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, author, politician, and former journalist in Afghanistan, Christoph Horstel out of Berlin, and a senior analyst of foreign policy in Focus, Ian Williams, out of New York. Thank you both for being with us. So let's start this off in New York. And Ian, are you surprised that the war in Afghanistan has been going on now for 17 years and still there seems to be no end in sight?
Well, I'm appalled that it's been going on, but I'm not surprised because loads of people at the time predicted. They thought that the American tactics in the so-called invasion, their use of warlords, bolstered instability in the country. And the refusal to actually talk to anyone in the Taliban or to consider that whether the Taliban represented a sort of Pushtun ethnicity rather than just an ideological, theological concept. All of this came together. One thing has been very clear is that the various troop movements have not been successful. And you know, this is without doubting the principle. You have to remember that this started in the Security Council when everybody stood up and pledged total support for the US in the war against terrorism. and the invasion was then backed by NATO on the principle that this was an attack on a NATO, that 9/11 was an attack on a NATO state. So there have been lots of people prepared to go along, but not many people prepared to actually say, you know, is this really what you want to do? And you remember what they did was they used CIA assets to take warlords and use them to fight the war by proxy. And if anyone was going to compete in unpopularity with the Taliban, it was these warlords. You know, Hekmaita and the others, they reduced Kabul to rubbish in their ensuing squabbles. None of them are popular with the Afghan public, and it made sure that there wasn't a stable Afghan institution, military and government to take over from the so-called International Association for Forces afterwards.
Well, let me get Christoph in this conversation. Now, when Washington invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Washington said it was targeting Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Now, after all these years, the Taliban is still a strong force in the country, and now other terrorist groups like Daesh has emerged. What does this all mean?
It means very simple that peace and stability and an order was never the plan of Washington. They interfered without any good reason for it. Afghanistan had not caused the 9/11 disaster. That was mainly self-made by the CIA with the help of the Saudi Arabs, who of course counted for most of the guys who flew in the planes. So what we have here right now is, of course, a plan to create trouble and disaster and make sure that Iran and China will never have fruitful relations, of course, reinforced by a good pipeline to lead Iranian gas to China, for example. That would be interesting. Or to lead the oil of Turkmenistan down to India. That would be good. But the Americans wanted to control this double pipeline of oil and gas, and we can all read this in American literature nowadays. That is not a secret or something like this. So what they did is they created trouble and disaster to make sure that either nobody controls Afghanistan as a disaster zone or Washington controls it. And this policy is coming to an end right now.
What do you mean coming to an end? Explain that, Christoph, sorry.
Well, it is very clear that, you know, sponsoring Daesh by Washington and allies in Afghanistan is the last effort they could do. And after that, it's Pakistan, it's Iran, it's Russia to make sure, together with China, that there will be peace and stability in the region without the US, of course, because with the US, peace and stability are not possible.
Okay. Well, when we look at the situation, turning back to Ian, we've even witnessed more mercenaries now involved in the Afghan war, such as Blackwater, of course, now known as the Academy. And when we look at its owner, Prince, and he's just proposed that Washington even privatize the war. Doesn't this prove that the war is actually profitable for the U.S.? Because it wouldn't, if it wasn't profitable, why would a mercenary actually want to take it over?
Well, it's profitable for Blackwater and similar people. It is not at all profitable for the British taxpayers or the American taxpayers or other NATO taxpayers who contribute towards it. When you see the sums involved, the Britain alone has put it into Afghanistan. It sort of it puts in perspective the so-called losses and benefits from Brexit. In the US, as we know, there is a bottomless pit for any defense spending whatsoever. Defense contractors can just keep on writing, the contracts and sending invoices, and they will be paid by a complacent Congress. But it's a disaster for the economy and for the US as a whole, of course.
So why well, let me just interrupt you there. So why is the U.S. still there? Sorry to interrupt you, Ian, but if it has been a disaster, really, we have reports that over $2.4 trillion has actually been spent by the U.S. on the Afghan war. So why stay?
Well, that's simple to my understanding.
Well, they're staying for the same reason they stayed in Vietnam.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian. I wanted to this. Go ahead.
Well, you know, I think there's a symbolic element which shouldn't be discounted in between the sordid details of pipelines, economic benefits. This war is because there's ideologically committed people in the US who are not prepared to admit that they can be beaten. They still haven't accepted they were beaten in Vietnam after all these years, 50 years later. They're not going to admit that they've been beaten in Afghanistan. And, you know, 17 years, by the way, is an underestimate, because really you should include the proxy war that your other guest pointed out the US was waging through the Taliban beforehand, because this was all a classic case of splashback. I mean, the US bankrolled a war by these Islamists and the Saudis against the existing government in Afghanistan. Whether it was good or not is another story. But it was not as obscurantist as the Taliban government when it came in. So the US has been involved there from the beginning, and to leave now would be to admit to the world that the US was basically busted.
Well, what about that, Christoph? Let me get you in on this. Is that it? Is it basically that the U.S. stay with me, Ian? That Christoph, that basically now the U.S. can't admit that it's lost the war. That's why it's very hard for it to leave. Or is there something else going on? We have even reports about and looking at the drug industry there and the opium and that connection. Your take on all of this?
Yeah, well, let's start with this fantastic opium connection. That is the only issue which in fact reaped any real money into Afghanistan through the Western interference. That is the drug dealing. And that, of course, does a lot of good things. It helps destabilizing Iran, it helps destabilizing Russia and a lot of other countries belonging formerly to the Soviet Union. And this stuff even reaches Europe. Fantastic story. You know, keep all these countries busy with these bad policies. The main thing, of course, is that America wants, Washington wants, the American taxpayer doesn't know anything about these dirty dealings. Washington wants, of course, to have some influence in the region. If they admit that this is all a failure, then of course they would have to rethink foreign policy. But foreign policy relies on all these principles of interference and use of troops. And my colleague here in this broadcasting has already pointed out that a lot of, armament companies and others from the defense sector are earning good money. This is the usual dirty business in Western politics. And unless, you make a U-turn and change your politics to something decent, all this kind of dirty behavior will, of course, continue. And putting pressure on Iran, putting pressure on China, and putting pressure of the former Soviet Southern republics, that is something that is necessary. Let me just briefly point out that this all started in 1974, when the Pakistani head of government, Bhutto, was given a free hand to develop a nuclear bomb. That was the payment, and his duty was to help destabilize Afghanistan. That is the story. And all other stories, many other stories come from that. For example, that the nuclear technology was then sold by Pakistan with tacit okay from the CIA to countries like Libya or Iran.
Okay, well, Ian, talking about the geopolitical importance of this, of Afghanistan for the U.S., now you said that the U.S. doesn't want to leave. Basically, it's hard for them to leave because they don't want to admit that they've lost this battle. But I want to look at actually the whole geopolitical aspect of this. I mean, Afghanistan's neighbors, several important countries, including Iran, China, and nearby Russia and India. How does this play in it that the U.S. wants to have a base or bases there in Afghanistan and have access to these countries?
Well, I think we can make a mistake in assuming that foreign policy in Washington is guided by rationality and logic. It's a whole welter of competing interests, all tugging in different ways. And I think I said before once on this program that I've likened American foreign policy to putting a dozen cats in a sack and then kicking them and then watching them fight and seeing where the sack ends up. There are loads of different interests involved in Washington, and they're with their allies tugging. We've already mentioned Pakistan, which has played a completely unscrupulous and notorious role in protecting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban all of these years and fomenting it with the intelligence services, while being a US ally and being armed by the US. And one thing that comes across is the complete lack of a joined-up foreign policy, is that the US can have an enemy, but they want that enemy to help them in other circumstances. You know, for example, the refusal to team up with Iran at the time of the Taliban, when the Taliban were as obnoxious to Iran as they were to the US, was yet another classic failure. So just think of the implications of a lack of policy. You can team up with a reactionary theocratic monarchy in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that's only recently allowed women to drive and still doesn't allow the vote, still has public executions of women for alleged adultery, and yet you cannot bear the idea that the Taliban might do the same thing. And even more odd, because of course the Taliban were being financed by the same Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that's now your best friend in the battle against Iran. So you know, there's a complete mismatch, disparity between any claimed principles and the reality on the ground.
Okay.
And it makes it very difficult for them to get allies to do this, because other people are aware of this.
Christoph, your take on that, because if we look at different situations, we know back in, I believe it was 2011, when the U.S. actually sent a drone and Iran captured that drone. The drone was sent from Afghanistan. So obviously it shows that this region is very important for the U.S. and, of course, Afghanistan gives it easier access to these countries. Your take on that side of things, that actually Washington does not want to leave?
Yeah, Washington cannot want to leave as long as the guys calling the shots in Washington, that is not our poor Mr. Trump or somebody else, that are cartels, you know, led by the financial cartel. So irrational, so-called irrational foreign policy is not irrational at all. That's very rational to them. They want to earn money. They want to have wars if necessary. And right now, because a huge global financial crash is looming, they need chances to start a huge global war. And this is what they are preparing in 7 places around the globe. I'm not going to specify on it, but in Afghanistan right now, that is very clear. If they leave, they lose the ability to put pressure on China, put pressure on Iran, put pressure on Pakistan, and of course, put pressure on Russia as well. They want to be strong there. There's a saying in Western analytical literature that those powers holding sway in Afghanistan, they are ruling the world. So that is something the Americans have well understood. The rationale, of course, is with the cartels. It's not with any president or something like this. It's not with NATO. They are all being used.
Well, Ian, now prior to being elected, U.S. President Donald Trump said that he wanted to get American troops out of Afghanistan. He also repeated that since being president. So what do you think has happened to change that policy? Because on the one hand, he said that he wanted to get them out, and on the other hand now he's saying that American troops are going to stay in Afghanistan.
Well, you have to remember the chameleon-like nature of Trump's policy pronunciations. He says what he thinks the audience wants to hear. It's not that he actually thinks through that policy and this is a considered policy. So he saw there was a reaction. Obama was under fire because of the behavior of the failure in Afghanistan. So he joined in attacking Obama. I mean, this is in the nature of Trump's politics and American politics, which is to identify who the scapegoat and the enemy is and then to pile everything on. It does not necessarily imply that you're in support of the opposite. So it's entirely consonant that then he comes up and America is a great country. How can a bunch of towel heads in Afghanistan beat us? I mean, same audience, he'll get the same applause and reaction. So, you know, his policy pronunciations are not to be taken as a serious policy guide. They're more a case of off-the-hip campaign speeches. But behind that, there's this whole panoply in Washington of decision makers who are guiding things. And there are people there who have, they've invested 17 years in a war in Afghanistan. They've invested 50 years in supporting Israel. They invested decades in a war in Vietnam. And they will never admit that they've ever been wrong. I said, look, you just have to look at Vietnam. You never get a sense in Washington now that Vietnam was a defeat, that they made any mistakes. Somehow official Washington doesn't do that. Vietnam considers itself to be the US's best friend. They haven't been to Washington and listened to them. They've never been forgiven. And it will be the same in Afghanistan. But then, on top of that, you do have all these other sordid commercial and geopolitical considerations. And Afghanistan is a crucial country. It's sort of like Switzerland in the middle of Europe. It's the piece that holds the rest of the jigsaw together.
Okay, let me get Christoph back in, because we're running out of time. But Christoph, in your perspective, the U.S. left Afghanistan. What do you think would happen in the country? Your prognosis of possible scenarios.
You see, various powers are there in the region. Your good country, Iran, is there, but there's China as well. Russia is growing stronger, trying to come to terms with Pakistan, something I strongly advised at the time a few years ago. And that happily happens. So if the Americans leave, I think very well these three countries mentioned, or four, they will be very well able to talk to the Afghan people and to make sure that some kind of commune order that then will start all over Afghanistan. The Taliban can be talked to. They are not at all irrational. I did that myself. I traveled with them as the only foreign Western journalist who got a visa from them after 9/11. That was done after Hekmatyar came in and said, let this guy in, and they did it. And it was very noticeable that they were ready to talk all the time. Even before 9/11 they were. So like this, I think there is a future. But let's understand that the Americans went in because they wanted to encircle Iran. They did war with Saddam Hussein. That was part of the encircling. And then they had a new Caspian initiative for the north that failed. And now they have lost Iraq. So the whole encircling business with Iran has failed, and this Afghanistan stronghold is, so to say, the last they had.
All right.
And they tried, of course, to maintain.
All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Appreciate both of you being with us. Author, politician, and former journalist in Afghanistan, Christoph Horstel out of Berlin, and senior analyst at Foreign Policy in Focus, Ian Williams, out of New York. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on Another Debate. I'm Marcia Hashimi. See you same time, same place tomorrow.